New Orleans, 1918. A city of rhythm, shadow, and sin, where jazz spilled from every corner bar, and the night air carried the perfume of magnolias and smoke. But that summer, something darker moved through the streets. Unseen, unstoppable, and armed with an axe. It began quietly. No warning, no motive, just blood with splinters and whispers of a killer who came and went like a ghost. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by stories that history refuses to let rest, consider subscribing, not just to follow another case, but to help keep their stories alive. The newspapers would soon call him the Axeman, but for the people of New Orleans, he was more than a name. He was the sound of footsteps in the dark, the echo of a door forced open, the realization that the city's beating heart, its music, its spirit, could not drown out the sound of terror. New Orleans in 1918 was a contradiction. It was alive, pulsing with jazz, crowded with immigrants, drenched in culture. But underneath that, poverty and disease crept through its neighborhoods. The Spanish flu was tightening its grip. War had taken young men overseas. And still, people danced. Among the Italian grocers, bakers, and families, the rhythm of daily life never stopped. Until the night of May 23rd, 1918. That's when the first door was broken open. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, an Italian couple running a small grocery on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Street. Family, hard-working, loved by their neighbors. At around 2 a.m., Joseph's brother Andrew, who lived nearby, heard strange sounds of the thin New Orleans air. It wasn't music. It was something else, a dull, rhythmic thud. When he entered their apartment later that morning, what he found would haunt him forever. The couple's throats had been slit. An axe, one of their own, had been left behind, smeared and abandoned. Police came quickly. Reporters even faster. There was no money missing, no signs of sexual assault, no clear motive. Only the weapon and a crude, bloody message scrawled near the door. Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony. The words made little sense, but they hinted at obsession. And perhaps prior knowledge. The city was uneasy, but at first it seemed like a domestic tragedy, until it happened again. In June of 1918, another grocer, Louis Bessumer, and his mistress Harriet Lowe, were attacked in their home. Again, an axe. Again, a door chiseled open with a panel removed. Again, the weapon left behind. Bessumer survived long enough to describe a tall figure dressed in dark clothing. Harriet Lowe, gravely wounded, told police before she died that it was Bessumer himself. But he was cleared, and the pattern continued. By August, panic began to spread through the Italian community. These weren't random crimes. They were surgical, intentional, and they carried a signature, an axe, a broken door, and nothing stolen. Reporters began linking the murders. Some blamed vagrants. Others whispered of a cult. But deep down, New Orleans knew the truth. Someone was hunting. People began sleeping in shifts. Men armed themselves with shotguns, sitting guard by their wives and children. Hardware stores ran out of locks, bars, and bolts. Even the city's musicians stopped playing late into the night. And through all this, one sound never stopped: jazz. Some said the killer moved with the rhythm of the music itself, that he walked the beat of the French Quarter, listening, waiting, choosing his next victims as the horns wailed through the humid night. The newspapers printed the word for the first time: Axeman, a name that would become a myth. In the months that followed, the Axeman vanished as quickly as he had appeared. Then he returned, March 1919. Another home, another shattered door. The victims, Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia, grocers, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary. The scene was almost identical, except this time there was a witness. Rosie survived, and her word sent police down a false path that would divide New Orleans. She named her neighbors, innocent people, driven by grief and confusion. They were convicted. But even behind bars, the killings continued, which meant only one thing. The Axeman was still out there. As fear reached its peak, a letter arrived, typed, taunting, and signed by the killer himself. It would become one of the most infamous letters in American crime history, and it promised death to anyone who didn't play jazz. March 1919. The people of New Orleans were exhausted, bruised by fear, restless from sleepless nights, haunted by an enemy no one could name. Police patrols filled the streets. Doors were double-bolted. And still the killer struck. But what came next was unlike anything the city had ever seen. A letter, addressed to the editor of the Times-Picayune, would transform a local terror into a legend. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. At 12:15 earthly time, next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. I will spare those persons in whose homes a jazz band is in full swing. I love jazz, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is playing. The date was Tuesday, March 19th, 1919. Every bar, dance hall, and parlor in New Orleans exploded with music. Jazz bands were booked solid. People danced in their homes, in the streets, in the back of corner stores, anywhere the sound of a horn could reach. The city refused to hide. Instead, it played, in defiance, in fear, and maybe in hope. Some claimed to have seen a shadow figure watching from rooftops. Others swore they felt his presence drifting through the humid air. But that night, no one died. No axe swung. No door was broken. The Axeman kept his word. The letter fascinated criminologists and terrified citizens. It was arrogant, taunting. Whoever wrote it wanted attention and control. Experts would later describe it as a rare mix of delusion and theatricality, something seen in modern-day serial killers like the Zodiac decades later. But in 1919, such psychological profiling didn't exist. All police knew was that the killer was methodical, intelligent, and fearless. The next attacks came in August 1919, when Steve Boca, another grocer, was attacked in his home. He survived, barely, but could remember nothing. Later that same month, Sarah Lawman, a young woman, was struck as she slept. Her skull fractured, but miraculously, she lived. Again, the same signature. A door panel removed, an axe left behind, nothing stolen. And once again the city whispered, "He's back." By October 1919, the Axeman spree seemed to fade, until Mike Pepitone was found murdered in his home. His wife discovered him moments after the attack. Blood splattered across the walls. Furniture overturned, the axe left nearby. This would be the last known attack attributed to the Axeman. No one saw him again. No arrests, no confessions, no justice. But what he left behind was far more than death. He left a city forever changed, and a legend that blurred fact and folklore. Over the decades, dozens of theories emerged. Some believed the Axeman was a mafioso, using fear to intimidate Italian immigrants into compliance. Others thought he was a deranged carpenter or drifter, skilled enough to remove door panels silently. One theory linked him to a man named Joseph Mumford, a known criminal later shot to death by a victim's widow, Mrs. Pepitone, in Los Angeles. Many newspapers embraced that story. It fit too neatly, but historians today doubt its truth. The records of Mumford's crimes don't align with the timeline. It may have been a coincidence or a convenient ending for a public desperate for closure. After 1919, New Orleans returned to its rhythm. The jazz scene flourished. Its musicians, Armstrong, Oliver, Bechet, carrying the sound of resilience across America. But beneath the trumpet's cry, there was always the echo of the Axeman, a killer who wrote poetry to the press, who turned murder into mythology, who made an entire city dance to stay alive. And perhaps that was his greatest cruelty. Not the blood, but the silence he left behind. Because after that night, the music never stopped. Not in defiance, not in fear, but in memory. When a city becomes a stage and fear becomes rhythm, you have to wonder, was the Axeman truly human, or something born from the city itself? By the end of 1919, the killings had stopped, but New Orleans wasn't the same. The Axeman had left more than bodies behind. He'd carved fear into the bones of the city. Families locked their doors. Grocers closed before sundown. And still, late at night, people swore they heard the faint sound of footsteps and the low hum of a trumpet fading in the dark. But in truth, the story didn't end in New Orleans. It just scattered across states, across decades, like the echo of a jazz note that refused to die. The early 1920s brought whispers of similar killings. In Lafayette, Louisiana, just a few hours west, a string of axe murders targeted families in their beds. Doors forced open. Axes left behind. Sound familiar? Police drew comparisons immediately. But whether it was the same man or simply a copycat inspired by headlines, no one could say. Then came Texas, Mississippi, even Chicago. Unsolved killings that shared the same eerie signature. No robbery, no motive, and a weapon found neatly at the scene. Some criminologists believe the Axeman could have been a traveling worker, perhaps moving along the rail lines. New Orleans was a port city, transient, restless, full of faces that came and went without trace. And maybe that's why he was never caught. He could have disappeared in plain sight. When people can't find answers, they build legends. And in New Orleans, a city steeped in mysticism, voodoo, and folklore, the Axeman became something almost supernatural. Some believe he was a spirit, a curse, or even a manifestation of the city's sins, punishment for its corruption, racism, and greed. Others pointed to the killer's strange obsession with jazz. Why would a murderer demand that a city play music? Or die? Musicians at the time spoke of it as a kind of twisted poetry. They joked that even the devil couldn't resist a good tune. But for some, the letter was more than a threat. It was a window into the mind of someone who saw himself as untouchable, a god over life and death. The Times-Picayune had printed the Axeman's letter without hesitation. It sold papers. It gripped readers. But it also gave the killer exactly what he wanted, an audience. Historians later criticized the press for fueling hysteria. By amplifying his message, they turned him from a murderer into a mythic figure, something larger than life. A headline from 1919 read, "The Demon Strikes Again, Another Family Slain by the Axeman." Each story blurred the line between fact and fear. And as the coverage spread, so did his legend. By 1920, life in New Orleans moved on. The jazz clubs reopened. The French Quarter buzzed with music again. But the police files remained open. Inside the precinct, detectives kept a box labeled simply Axeman. Newspaper clippings, photos of bloody bedrooms, handwritten notes, statements from traumatized witnesses, all sealed away. No fingerprints, no solid leads, Only questions. Did he die? Was he arrested for another crime? Did he move on to another city, another name, another pattern? No one could say. In the years that followed, the Axeman became a piece of New Orleans folklore. Jazz bands wrote songs about him. Writers and filmmakers reimagined him, a phantom killer dancing to the sound of saxophones. Even television would revisit his story a century later, blending fact with fiction. In 2014, American Horror Story, Coven introduced a version of the Axeman, played as a seductive, jazz-loving spirit, half killer, half ghost. It was pure fantasy, but it showed how deeply the legend had embedded itself into the American imagination. The real Axeman, though, remains lost to time. No fingerprints, no confessions, no evidence that could hold up in any court. Just a haunting certainty that he once existed, and that somewhere someone remembered his face. When you walk through New Orleans today, past the dim alleys and shuttered shops, it's easy to forget, but every city has ghosts, not the kind that haunt houses, but the kind that haunt stories. The Axeman is one of them. He wasn't the first serial killer in America, but he was the first to turn fear into theater. And in a city that danced with death long before he came. His story was never buried. It was absorbed. The jazz kept playing. The city kept moving. And the shadow he cast never truly faded. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't who he was, but how he made an entire city perform for him. And a century later, we're still listening for the beat. New Orleans, 100 years later. The city still hums with life, music, and mystery, but every generation that passes seems to circle back to one story. The tale of a faceless killer who moved through the dark like smoke. The man or myth they call the Axeman. More than a century has passed since his last known strike. And yet his shadow still lingers in music, in books, in whispered conversations about evil and anonymity. But what really remains is not just a fear. It's the question, who was he and why? In the late 20th century, a handful of historians and amateur detectives began revisiting the original police files. Many of those documents have been lost to time, but fragments survived, enough to paint a clearer picture. The evidence pointed to consistency. All attacks took place at night. All involved Italian grocers or their families. The doors were entered by removing a panel with a chisel. The weapon was always an axe, often belonging to the victim. But what stood out most wasn't what he took. It was what he left behind. The Axeman never stole, never assaulted, never stayed. Each crime was precise, like a ritual, a violent, almost theatrical act meant to make a statement no one fully understood. And yet, even with modern methods, criminal profiling, forensic psychology, the truth remains slippery. If he existed today, we'd call him an organized killer. Methodical, intelligent, deliberate. Someone who planned each move, who studied his victims, and thrived on control. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, years later, would outline patterns common in killers of his kind. They seek power. They crave attention. And they often leave behind a message, not for the victims, but for the public. The Axeman's letter fits this mold perfectly. It's grandiose, taunting, written with flair. He calls himself a demon from the hottest hell, not because he believed it, but because he wanted you to, by making himself mythic. He made himself untouchable. Some criminologists now believe he may have been a deeply narcissistic man, possibly suffering from psychosis, yet capable of calculated planning, a predator who hid behind performance. And in a city like New Orleans, where fact and folklore intertwine, he found a perfect stage. One of the longest-standing theories tied the Axeman to Joseph Mumford, a career criminal and extortionist with ties to organized crime. According to one sensational 1920 article, Mrs. Mike Pepitone, widow of the Axeman's final known victim, tracked Mumford to Los Angeles and shot him dead. She told police she believed he had murdered her husband. The story spread quickly. It sounded like justice, poetic, cinematic, complete. But when historians searched official records, the details fell apart. There was no proof of any such confrontation, no documentation linking Mumford to the New Orleans attacks, and no official record of a woman named Pepitone being tried for murder in Los Angeles. It was more likely another legend born from the city's hunger for closure, because truth in cases like this is often too unsatisfying. The idea that the killer simply vanished, that he could have died an ordinary man, felt unbearable. So people built him into something more. Perhaps what truly immortalized the Axeman wasn't his crimes, but his connection to jazz. The night the entire city played music to survive. That was a story no one forgot. It became part of New Orleans' identity, a tale of defiance wrapped in melody. Bands wrote songs about it. Louis Armstrong himself recorded a tune called the Axeman's Jazz. For many, the killer became a symbol not of fear, but of resilience, a reminder that even when terror knocked, the city answered with sound. And that irony, that a murderous threat helped shape the culture he tried to terrify, is what makes this story so enduring. Because New Orleans didn't give in. It danced. It played. It lived. Every few years, the case resurfaces. True crime researchers pick it apart. Podcasts, documentaries. Even police historians still revisit those files, hoping technology might unearth what time concealed. DNA evidence is impossible now. Too much decay, too many lost items. But some patterns endure. The Axeman's crimes foreshadowed the rise of later American serial killers. Jack the Ripper in London, the Zodiac in California, the Phantom Killer in Texarkana. Each thrived on spectacle, fear, and communication with the press. And in that lineage, the Axeman stands as one of the earliest, a blueprint for the criminal who kills for narrative as much as for need. When people walk through the French Quarter today, they still talk about him. Tour guides point to houses where the attacks took place, the faint scratches on the door frames, the echoes in the wood. But the real story isn't about the killer. It's about the city that refused to break. New Orleans turned its fear into folklore, its pain into rhythm. It remembered, but it never surrendered. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Axeman. Not a man in the shadows with an axe, but the spirit of a place that faced darkness and responded with art. A place where tragedy becomes melody, and where the ghosts, no matter how terrifying, are always outnumbered by the music. We may never know who the Axeman was. A vengeful drifter? A criminal hiding behind chaos? Or something stranger, a story born from fear that grew larger than truth itself. But every legend carries a lesson. And in this one, perhaps the lesson is this: evil seeks silence, and New Orleans answer with song. So the next time you walk down a dim street and hear distant jazz playing through an open window, remember that night in 1919 when an entire city played to stay alive. And remember, some phantoms never vanish. They just change their rhythm.